Joining me, Adrian Elrod, former senior advisor to Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, Republican strategist Evan Siegfried, and NBC News senior politics editor Beth Fooey. So I want to put the candidate poll back up there if we can. It's interesting to me that in this Des Moines Register poll, the top two have a combined age of 153.
Well, if you put it that way.
Adrian, does that tell us anything?
No, look, what it tells us is, first of all, these early state polls are largely based on high name ID recognition right now.
So this is a name recognition poll, essentially.
I think essentially, but look, these are also two well-known people, right? Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders have very high name ID, and they're also very well known by the caucus goers. And of course, Bernie Sanders narrowly lost Iowa to us in 2016 to Hillary Clinton's campaign, so it's no surprise that he's doing well. But what I found very interesting about this poll is the way caucus goers were talking about Joe Biden. They basically said, look, we want him to run. And we also don't think that his policies are too moderate or too liberal. We think they're perfect. That's a very good sign for Joe Biden. If I were him still thinking about running, I'd look at this poll and say, you know what? I think I may jump in.
Yeah, I wonder, a good sign for Joe Biden, but maybe also a lesson for the other people who are in the race, one of whom is Pete Buttigieg, Mayor Pete, right? He's down at the bottom of this poll. Having said that, a lot of people were impressed by what he did at South by Southwest this weekend, and we have a little bit more of one of the exchanges. Take a look.
Do you think Vice President Pence would be a better or worse president than President Trump?
His interpretation of Scripture is pretty different from mine to begin with. But even if you buy into that, how could he allow himself to become the cheerleader of the porn star presidency? Is it that he stopped believing in Scripture when he started believing in Donald Trump? I don't know.
Yeah, look at this poll. I mean, he's got 1%. He's down there with Inslee and Delaney and Castro and Bullock. And but I wonder, am I living in the 20th century or do people still look for a presidential candidate they would want to have a beer with? And is that the guy we just saw there?
I think after President Trump's election, I think a lot of Democrats have really changed the paradigm there. They don't care who is going to, whether that person can have a beer with them or is somebody they want to be friends with. They want somebody to win. That's when I go out into these early states. That's the only thing I hear. Who can beat Trump? They are happy with any of these candidates.
Do you have to have that personality, Adrian?
Well, I think it's important, and I think what we saw last night with Pete Buttigieg. I always mess up his name. That was a moment. I mean, he had what we call a moment in politics. It's really hard to break through when you've got 15 or 20 people running in a Democratic primary. But he had a moment last night. I think you're going to see a lot more of that coming from him. He's a rising star in our party. Whether or not he does well, we'll see what happens in 2020. But he's got a bright future.
I will say this: the data from Google Trends, because we had two other Democratic candidates who were trying to break out, John Delaney and Tulsi Gabbard. The data from Google Trends showed very little searches on John Delaney, a little bit more on Tulsi Gabbard, and Pete Buttigieg went through the roof. He is somebody who could find himself on the main debate stage by the sheer force of will. He has a very interesting experience, and he recognizes, yes, I'm the only millennial in this race running, and I think that is actually a plus. He takes a very different attack to politics, and it's very relatable. It's somebody I would not sleep on. He might not get the nomination, but he's certainly valuable.
10 years younger than Beto O'Rourke, who a lot of people are looking at as this, sort of young guy who could come in.
I think back to your original point about Biden and Bernie being older. I mean, there's no doubt that the fact that they are the ages that they are going to be an issue. However, what I've seen so far out on the campaign trail, they're sort of different, the two of them. Bernie still has this incredible appeal among young people, young college students. They see him as carrying the message that they want from all of these candidates. Biden, on the other hand, very much feels like kind of a relic of the 20th century. I mean, there's going to be a ton of oppo that's going to be dropped on him of things that he said about busing in the 70s. He's a man of his time. He's a man of the prime of his career, which was at a very different moment for Democrats. Whereas Bernie Sanders has been consistent throughout his entire career. He doesn't seem to these young voters that he's old. They see him as somebody who's carrying the message that they believe in.
And yet he would totally shake up the race, and so would Beto O'Rourke, right? I mean, he's very buzzy. A lot of people have said he hasn't done the groundwork. He doesn't have in place what you should have in place by this point if you're going to run a serious national presidential campaign. He's definitely untested. You could argue he's a little quirky. People talking about his road trip, about the fact that he snuck into the screening of his documentary, and that he's kind of saying, well, I made my decision, but I'm not telling you, which is ticking a few people off. But if he does get in, how does it change the race?
Well, I think look, the field's already strong so far. So anybody who's like,
spoken like a true Democrat. But how does it change the race?
I think he changes the race in that he just adds another dimension in terms of somebody else for folks to support. I think he will be a top contender when he jumps in. I frankly think he should have jumped in right after the momentum of his Senate race when he raised record amounts of money in January, because I think he could have continued to ride that momentum. But, I think he changed the race. I think he puts Texas in play in the general election if he gets far. And I think that he's going to attract a lot of younger millennial types of voters.
He may split
the Bernie Sanders vote there.
Urban voters. What did you find out?
Here's what I'm looking at in this race. We see that Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden are the top two. And to Beth's point, there's a generational divide between those. Younger voters are going toward Bernie Sanders, and older voters are going toward Joe Biden.
Precisely.
But when Beto O'Rourke gets in the race, if he does, which we all think he will, who hurts from that? Bernie Sanders. He siphons off votes, and Joe Biden sits smiling. Beto O'Rourke would be the best thing to happen to Joe Biden's candidacy when that is announced, because it drives the Bernie people nuts. And we've seen since December, Bernie Sanders' allies have been going after, in very big whisper campaigns and sometimes more pronounced campaigns, Beto O'Rourke. They've been saying, oh, he votes with Trump X percentage of the time. And they've been doing these little pot shots at him. And also, they've been saying he should be running for the Senate. And I actually agree he would be a better Senate candidate than he would be a presidential candidate. He's the second presidential candidate in this race third, who is spurned Chuck Schumer and said, I'm going to run for president instead of running for the Senate.
Well, he hasn't quite done that yet, but a lot of people think, well, Beth, we talk about this whenever it happens, when they make the announcement, here's where we're going to have our convention. Does Milwaukee help the Democrats, or is that just something we talk about?
Every time we see the selection of a convention site, it's like, this state's suddenly in play, or this state that wasn't chosen is suddenly out of play. I am not a believer in any of that, quite frankly. There's no evidence that a convention is going to deliver a state. That said, it's a good symbolic message, as we well know. Democrats didn't play in Wisconsin. It is a state that has had it used to be a very Democratic state. Scott Walker and Republicans in the last decade have made it a very Republican state. With the Democratic governor this time only won by the slightest amount, and there's still a very strong Republican infrastructure. If Democrats are going to start making some more headway in that state, it's not a bad idea to go to Milwaukee.
Beth, always great to have you. Adrian Evan are sticking around. Back with me, former senior Hillary Clinton advisor Adrian Elrod and Republican strategist Evan Siegfried. So, Evan, the headline out of this was about the Jewish comments, and I'll get back to that. But overall, I'm reading this, I'm looking at him nicknaming his opponents. Is all of this just setting up his 2020 messaging? He's with the donors and he's testing all this out.
Well, first of all, shouldn't Elizabeth Warren technically be the nutty professor, as she was a professor, unlike Bernie Sanders? Yes, he loves to do the nicknames and play the little games that'll be the little bumper sticker slogan that his base will eat up and say this is great. But the president has to get more than his base in order to be reelected. He's got to offer something to those persuadable voters who might have voted for him last time but are now saying, the country isn't going in the right direction.
But he's looking for that back and forth. He's looking to see what gets a reaction, right?
Of course. He's focus group testing everybody that he comes across, be it the White House steward to the RNC donors. That's Donald Trump and who he is. He does it at his rallies, too. I think that the president is really trying to go out there and find those messages that stick. And when they stick, he'll keep running with them until they die.
Maybe he thought that crazy Bernie didn't work as well as he wanted it to, and that's why he's now switched to the nutty professor. I was trying to figure that one out, Adrian. But the one thing I will say, having been out for months with Republican candidates, starting with Jeb Bush, a lot of those candidates let those nicknames and those critiques get under their skin. Do you think the Democrats have lived and learned?
I think they have, and I think Elizabeth Warren is the perfect example of somebody who, Trump has tried to define and to an extent has defined, but she has not let that define her campaign.
I'm not sure a lot of people would be agreeing with you about the way she handled.
Well, no, I do think that she mishandled. I think that she could have handled addressing the situation better, Pocahontas, but I also think that she has gone forward and charted her own path in terms of introducing policies and literally leading the way in terms of economic policies and an economic agenda on the Democratic Party side. But look, this is the problem that Democrats are going to have is Donald Trump knows how to manipulate the media cycle to his advantage. And if Democrats do play into those hands, if Democratic candidates do fall prey to his attempts to try to control the media cycle, that's going to be to their detriment. People have got to chart their own path. That's why the debates are so important, and that's why moments like we said with Mayor Pete earlier in the program are so important, because it allows candidates to define themselves and their own messages on their own terms.
All right, from Republicans' perspective then, Evan, who is the Democrat or Democrats who can best do, I think, those two things that a lot of people would agree with that they have to do? And one is to be able to not only not let Donald Trump get under your skin, but also learn how to control a news cycle as well as he does.
Well, think of it this way. I've always looked at it as, who should Democrats nominate that they think should be up against Donald Trump in a debate stage? Who would be best to do that? Remember Ronald Reagan just did the, oh, shucks, there you go again? That's Joe Biden. Joe Biden, I think, is the strongest one because he reminds people, A, of an era where there was more decency in politics. And he's a fundamentally decent man. I disagree with Joe Biden on numerous policies, but I look at him and I say, this is a man whom I respect as an individual. And I think that a lot of Americans do too. And when they see Donald Trump do the bluster, Joe Biden can offer a clear contrast to that. I don't see Bernie Sanders being able to do that. I don't see Elizabeth Warren or Kamala Harris, certainly not Tulsi Gabbard.
But I want to make this point, Evan. We've got 12 debates in the Democratic primary, so I think it's too early to judge right now who actually can be that one and only person who's standing on the debate stage taking on Trump. I agree. I think Joe Biden would do great. And be very formidable, but I also think Kamala Harris and some other candidates who are running for the presidency, we need to see how they do on the debate stage. They're going to have their moments. Again, we've got 12 debates split into 2 nights, the first 2 at least. So there's going to be a lot of airtime for these folks to really prove their case and prove that they can take on Trump on that debate stage.
All right, and so I want you to deconstruct in our last minute or so the president saying Democrats hate Jewish people.
No, I think that was an over-the-top statement, and it was wrong of the president to say. However, I do believe there are Democrats within the party who are going out and making anti-Semitic statements. Ilhan Omar has been doing it.
Does he think that audience, that's something they would respond to? I'm trying to figure out why.
It's message testing partially, and also because within the Republican base, myself included, we've been pretty incensed at what Ilhan Omar's been able to get away with. She's going out and saying it's all about the Benjamins. Israel has hypnotized the world to their evils. You look at Ilhan Omar's record, and then look, New York City just elected Jumaane Williams to be public advocate. Jumaane Williams has gone out and said that he will never condone somebody who's a convicted Palestinian terrorist because they're a freedom fighter. She happened to murder 2 Israeli teenagers.
Okay,
but I
Jewish people.
But the thing is, there is an anti-Semitism problem within a wing of the Democratic Party, and we saw last week with the resolution when it was very open and shut. It should have just been the resolution to condemn anti-Semitism, and then it turned into, oh no, we have to condemn everything else. What does that send to Jewish people? Even anecdotally, yes. Even neighbors of mine who are staunch liberals who will vote said that it was disgusting, that the Democrats should have stood up and said Ilhan Omar was wrong. Instead, they just watered it down and said hate is bad.
Look, I mean, that was a very loaded comment that you just made. Look, there are a couple bad actors in our party who have made statements that have not been helpful, but they are a handful of Democrats, and we have a very large number of Democrats in Congress and a very wide, diverse caucus. So, yes, you're going to have a couple members who occasionally say things that are not helpful, but that certainly does not define what the Democratic Party
stands for. But your new party leader,
whole.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez,
she is not our party leader.
But she started fundraising off of it.
Can we go back to the Democratic, not the primary stage, but, well, maybe the primary stage. So they're going to be asked to respond to things like that. Is the way to handle these kinds of clearly over-the-top statements, in some cases, you could use worse descriptive words for some of those statements, dismissive? Do you have to take everything he says seriously? Because I do think that there is this feeling among a lot of people, okay, he said something else, and
right.
I'm exhausted, and I can't, How do you deal with that as a Democrat, whether you're asked about it on a stage with other Democrats or ultimately you're the nominee?
If I was advising somebody, a candidate who was about to go on a Democratic Party debate, I would make it very clear that you should pivot as quickly as you possibly can on a question like that. Because, again, if we list pivot to your message, what you want to get across in your 30-second response, if we address every single misstatement or something that we don't agree with as Democrats, if we give that statement as much oxygen as we've given AOC statements and Omar's statements, then we're never going to be able to get our message out.
Any sort of anti-Semitic statement should be called out for being anti-Semitic. You can't do what Nancy Pelosi did last week and say, oh, she's just uninformed, and essentially said she's stupid and not capable of thinking for herself.
Evan, Adrian, thanks to both of you. Appreciate it.